Game loaded.
Hi, and welcome to an edition of Lessons Learned with your host, Rafael Piñero. Welcome once again to the Mathsquad Community Podcast with Scary DM this time around. Scary DM?
Hello.
This is going to be a shorter program. We only have one guest today, but hopefully it will be as entertaining, if not more so than the last time. And we'll be talking about cooperative world building. Last time we talked about the games we liked, and we came to a consensus that we like game systems that encourage player participation not only in rolling die and in combat, but also in constructing a joint world, a joint narrative. So what is it about cooperative world building that is so enjoyable?
I think part of it comes down to what tools it gives the GM and the other players to actually live up to whatever their concept was for their characters. With from the GM side, it's much less prep intensive and requires much less from the GM in terms of knowing how their setting works. It allows the GM to improvise a lot more or to pass off a lot of responsibility, which makes their job a lot less stressful. But for players, so much of it comes down to, well, I have this idea of my character, but I don't really know what the world is like. And if we're playing a more prep-intensive setting, then you have to actually compromise a lot of what you were intending your character to be. But if it's more of a cooperative setting, then you can sort of craft aspects of the world to fit what your idea of your character is. You don't really have to constantly compromise what you were trying to figure out with the setting or the game.
So at least two advantages. One of them is simplicity upfront for whoever is going to run the game, the GM, and a lot of flexibility for the players to craft their characters and their experience as they go along. However, I think that for the GM, it sort of shifts the timing of the prep, if you will, because they have to then be Johnny on the spot when it comes to taking notes. Because once something is laid down, it becomes part of the setting. They have to have a note or something and then be able to extrapolate from there. Or does the cooperative world building allow for continued growth between sessions as well?
I think it sort of depends on the game. Games like Burning Wheel, from my experience, note-taking does become very important because as the setting develops, it gets more and more intricate and detailed, and you can't really retcon a lot of things with how that game works. You're basically just building outwards with a highly detailed scenario. But when playing games like Apocalypse World, so much of it you can just sort of gloss over or just sort of change later in the future because of either the mechanics or just sort of how the setting exists within that game, that you can then sort of make it much less notes intensive because the setting is not as important in its details as the characters are. A lot of it just comes down to notes on who the characters are and not so much the characters and the setting and details about the setting you figure out.
Mm-hmm. But which brings another question. What happens when you have different players, right, who have perhaps at times very divergent ideas of what they think the setting should be? Or more to the point, they're doing their own thing, like their own characters. Say one has a very wild idea about what dwarf should be, and that may not be compatible with the idea of what the player that's playing an elf thinks the world should be. How do you reconcile those? And do you do it in the table or do you do it off table?
I've had a couple different versions of this come up, but it's more in terms of how serious certain people want to take things versus other people. And in some cases, it did come down to something you have to talk about outside of the game. But in other times, it came down to a situation of, well, why don't we have it be both? And we'll just lay out how this is actually a way more complicated situation than you'd normally expect. Like maybe all the dwarves that the elves actually interacted with were like how they thought they were. And maybe the dwarves that the actual dwarf came from were very, very different. And then you can actually work out, well, did these two groups know about each other? Is this like an internal struggle among dwarf culture? Like which sort of paradigm they follow? Something like that. Usually there's a way to reconcile it between different player characters. The main point where I had it sort of break down came from the fact where certain players just wanted things to be way more serious or punishing than other players. So certain players would want things to be very serious and dark in setting, while other players would just constantly sort of undermine all of these things that the other players that wanted things to be more serious would be doing. So you'd be in like some very tense, stealthy situation, and then one of the characters does something incredibly silly and off the wall that just sort of, in some ways it sort of breaks the fourth wall of the fiction you've been creating, and in other ways it just sort of like totally breaks like the mood of the setting, which is fine in some situations, but and others not so much. But I don't think that's really as much a flaw of world building as it is just something that comes up in play in general.
So it's more of a player dynamics and the group dynamics rather than the approach as it is.
Yeah. I think it can definitely sort of make it come to the forefront more readily, but I don't think it's a unique problem. I think it's just the way things are constructed. It makes the problem more obvious early on.
Yeah, I ask that because I think that's something that is happening in my own group right now. Like I said in the last podcast, we are playing D&D 5th edition. And we are essentially taking the sort of cooperative world-building approach, at least to the characters. And so the acts of one character seem to clash with the views of another character. Essentially, it boiled down to having a chaotic good half-orc being invited into an orgy with several succubi in the throne room or layer of existence of the Lords of Chaos. While the neutral good paladin and the player behind them didn't think that was going a little too far. So it didn't sort of fit the milieu. It sort of got resolved in other aspects that the character actually turns out to be not entirely chaotic. It also is a good character. But it was that sort of like clash of attitudes. Like, wait a minute, that seems to be going too far. But to the player and to the DM, it was perfectly fine. It was, it's just like going into the bar and hiring some wenches or something. I mean, but you can have those clashes happen.
Yeah, that's something I see actually fairly often in D&D games, where there's a lot of issues in regards to how high magic or like how much heroic fantasy is within a traditional D&D game. And there's such huge variance between how different groups run it or how different campaigns just go over time that it can be sort of hard to have an expectation of what you're wanting the game to be until something happens that just totally breaks with that. And so like in a lot of games, I'd run things more gritty and serious, but my players would end up expecting there to be much more high fantasy elements. So like much more fantastic magical beasts, magic shops to be a common thing, or things like planar travel to actually be like a facet of the system, or things like teleportation circles. And while the setting I'd be creating would be much more low magic. And so if you don't really explicitly explain all that ahead of time, you can end up having players that feel sort of like betrayed in a sense, or they just feel like their expectations aren't being met and they're confused about what they're really going to be getting out of the setting.
So one of the jobs of the GM is managing expectations rather than saying guiding them down a specific path, right? Being able to fit the different takes from different characters and their players into sort of this communal shared view.
Yeah, something that ends up happening with the DMs, in my experience, was you end up guiding a lot of behavior out of game more than you would intentionally beforehand, because so much of it comes down to creating like a communal view of the world together, that you actually have to like mediate a lot of conversations that happen out of the game about like, well, what are our expectations for this thing? What do we feel is a comfortable sort of medium between the different things people want? And a lot of that I ended up sort of working through by having a sort of like set pattern that I went through for establishing facts about the world, where I just have people first decide on just like a general climate, a general just sort of like geography of a region. Because if you establish that first, then you can sort of get people on a relatively same page. And then you decide on like, what do you want the general feel of the game to be? And so that's where you can actually get into, before you make anything else that could actually like break with the setting between people, it's, do we want things to be dark and serious? Do we want things to be sort of silly? Do we want there to be much magic or not much magic? And if you get all of those done ahead of time, then I find it's a lot easier to keep things consistent from then on out. But if you start with things like, what is an interesting idea for some city in my setting, or what is an interesting like political situation going on, then you end up getting problems where there's inconsistent elements because you weren't really thinking about the big picture sort of unifying theme of your game beforehand. And that's basically how I screwed up like almost all of my campaigns at the start.
So your solution is, I would say somewhat ironically, is that you, when people think about this cooperative world building, start small, like, you know, individual characters and individual aspects of characters or building or something like that, and then build up. You're saying, no, you have to start large, which is very similar to how general world building is done, you know, regions and geography and sort of thing, and then have the players and yourself sort of fill in the middle and lower layers.
Yeah, I think you have to start with a big broad map of what you want the game to be, like where it's happening, what you want it to be. And then you can jump down into a small level of like, okay, we have the general idea. Now, what are the more specific things that fill this out? And from there, after you establish like this big overarching theme, then you start with the characters and build out from there. Because you have a general sort of, you have a way to make everything sort of relate to each other in a general level. And you can sort of position things in such a way that it's going to be consistent for all the players. But you don't actually have to know all of the details anymore, because you sort of know in a general sense what everything's going to be as you build out from the players from then on.
So constant communication in and out of the game is very important. Do you basically carve out spaces for yourself and then some for the players? Like, for example, you basically said the big world building, the sort of the general space, that's one that you set yourself, and then say, okay, fine, but about, say, a character's religion, I'm going to let the player talk about that particular thing, or their descendants or what have you. Is that how it, or is it just, again, a constant conversation where things can change depending on sort of the communal approach, the agreement?
Yeah. Part of the advantage was that it took a lot more burden off of me and really a lot of the other players too, because when everything is sort of a communal creative effort, then if you don't have a really good idea of something, then you can just sort of ask the table, like, well, what would be interesting for my character's religion? I don't have a very good idea of it. I sort of know that, like, maybe I want it to be some form of, like, stoicism, but I don't really have any good idea about the details. And then you can just sort of throw it to the other players, and they'll fill out lots of details. And maybe someone has a really good idea for a religion that it doesn't fit their character, but it would fit your character, and maybe that would be interesting for everyone else. And that can sort of happen for literally everything that goes through the game. As for things that I carve out, it's something that I end up doing as the setting develops, where if some sort of hook comes in, where we've developed some sort of precedent in the setting where I'll have some sort of interesting thing to dive a lot more into. Like, say, we established that there's some big wasteland off to the south that nobody goes in, and it's sort of an area where everything is like died off and there's smells of sulfur and everything. Well, that just gave me a big area that I can play around in and create something interesting in. And then I'll just sort of carve that away in the background until it becomes relevant again. And so I'll just sort of pick up pieces from what players say.
Yeah, also, and this is something I think I should have said at the beginning, the whole premise of sort of cooperative world building and cooperative sort of role play in this case is based on, at least the GM, the rule of yes and. The idea that when a player suggests something or wants to do something, you say, okay, that's cool. And what comes next? So that's sort of the basis of the conversation. It's like you're always trying to encourage your players to give you information so that you can sort of fit it into the world and then go from there. However, sometimes you're also supposed to say, no, but. Have there been any situations where you find yourself increasingly saying, no, I can't do that, but I wish I could do something else?
I find that happens less and less the more experience I get. But at the same time, there are certain situations where that does just show up more. And it's usually to do around situations involving combat or like direct threats to player characters. And a lot of that has to be, I just basically have to get the player to focus in and be like, okay, there is this danger. You just have to deal with this danger on these terms. We can't keep switching it out to sort of like get you out of this danger anymore. We sort of have to focus down on it within this setting. And sometimes that can be a lot more vague. Like, say, there's some sort of like ship combat during a large storm, and a player sort of starts getting nervous about like losing something in that setting. And so you'll get them trying to do things that are a bit more stretching the fiction than they normally would be. And in those situations, you have to kind of be like, well, no, you can't do that, but I'll let you do something similar.
The idea being that they want to take advantage of the inherent flexibility in this method to say, well, if I can decide that that this is something about my character, then I have this sort of this magic box I can pull something that will always save the day. And that sometimes doesn't fit what you're trying to do. It's sort of, again, stretching the fiction to perhaps a breaking point at the moment. So you have to say, well, I wish I could, but if you give me an alternative, I'll consider it, right? Another interesting thing about all this is that the way the campaign, if you're having a campaign, shapes up can be a bit disjointed. Not that, fantasy campaigns or even RPG campaigns necessarily have very coherent storylines, but it can be, you can be sort of being pushed back and forth between the different needs of the players. How do you balance sort of the different storylines that the players come up with, again, to have sort of this shared experience?
I mean, part of that is you don't let the players make too much beforehand. I find having all the character creation and such done during play as a group mitigates that somewhat. If you have everyone make their characters separately beforehand, then you get a case of they're building up a lot of backstory and things that don't necessarily tie together, and things aren't really as unified as they could be. But if everyone's making their characters and their backgrounds and everything all at once, then players will just sort of naturally build off of each other, and that'll sort of tie things together a lot more. And besides that, I just make it a conscious effort to try and keep all of the players in a group sort of involved in everyone else's storyline in some way. So that way you don't really get a situation where someone just has to go on their personal quest for a while by themselves. If you can keep everything being some way related to everyone else, it goes a long way.
Bringing another example from Mirror Shades, the fact that Adam sort of at midway to the game gave, after the Tokyo arc, gave everybody a series of flashbacks that they could play at any moment. I think that was very interesting because everybody has an evolving concept of their character, but at that moment they could decide, okay, I want to cement this very specific thing about the character. But the characters were not really burdened by a sort of a very extensive background. They didn't write paragraph after paragraph of background elements that either would burden the character or would never get used, which is something that happened to me, where I like to write intensive backgrounds about my characters, present them to the GM and say, hey, look, my character has all these things, and look how interesting and wonderful the character is because he has his relationships. And like, oh, okay, I'll have a look at it. It looks interesting. I'll see if I can use it. And they never get used. But by using the sort of flashbacks approach, that allowed the players to sort of go back in time retroactively and fix certain things that can help the flow of the game.
Yeah, he definitely handled flashbacks well, and I think he got part of that from Blades in the Dark, which is really the first setting I've seen to really incorporate flashbacks as a big part of how the setting works. And I'm not really sure how best to utilize it as it is. I think it's much better for things that are more specific and tied around, well, we're on this mission now. Let's flash back to something I did in preparation for the mission. For backstory things, I'm not sure it really works as well. The reason I think it worked well in Mirror Shades was also more that they played for a while, then they had a big time jump, and then resumed it again. And time jumps are something a lot of players and games are sort of hesitant to do at the best of times. And I think it can definitely work well and needs to be added in more, but I'm not really sure about it.
Yeah, I know some players who they loathe the time jump. They want to just, play the day by day, the week by week. They want to be constantly on. And the time jump seems to throw them off for a loop or something. But I did like the flashback. So essentially shorter range, flashbacks are better than very long range ones that, stretch perhaps months or even years and may take the character outside of what's going on at the time. It should be tied into whatever they're doing at the moment, as opposed to just being, half hours, you recounting how you got your first toy car or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely ways to make that a thing, but it's going to be very sparse and it's going to be very fiction specific. So like, say you bring in a relative of a player character for the first time and you've not really talked about this or fleshed them out at all. It might be appropriate then to have the player flashback to like, what is the defining moment in your relationship with, say, your mom? Like, narrate us a scene of you interacting with your mom that sort of has the same general feel like what your relationship is with your mom. Like, is it super loving and caring and affectionate? Or was she like super distant and a bit harsh on you? Like, it could definitely work in situations like that. But I think it's very dependent on just what the fiction is at the time.
Mm-hmm. Also, I think a term that some that borrow from video games, signposting, I think is very important. In this content conversation between GM and players, I think one of the responsibilities of the GM is to clearly signpost chances for the player to add to the story, whether it's a character background event, whether it's a makeup of a religion or a region, whatever. Because if you don't signpost correctly, or not correctly, but clearly, then players might feel like they're missing out the opportunity to contribute. But of course, the question is, again, how do you balance signposting between your players?
Yeah, I think Dungeon World handled this well, and in some ways Burning Wheel did too, where a lot of it came down to, if something comes up, ask the player it's affecting the details about it. Have that player explain all the details about like whatever the setting is. So like a band of mercenaries had picked up the contract to hunt down this player because of something they did. Well, just have that player explain who the heck the band of mercenaries is. And so like it definitely hammers in to like constantly ask the player, like, what is it? What are the details? Who is this person? Things like that. And to sort of stop people from getting too ridiculous about it, Burning Wheel has this rule they sort of reiterate throughout the book where they're like, if you think a player is trying to metagame or min-max things too hard, the other players get to yell at them and change it instead.
Peer pressure always works, has it?
Yeah.
So to round out our discussion on cooperative world building and cooperative role-playing, which might seem a bit redundant since role-playing always has a cooperative element. Good communication between GM and players and constant communication both in and out of the table is important. Signposting, creating a structure perhaps and defining sort of the outer edges of the experience and then build from there. And having a knowledge of your game mechanics as well as game dynamics and table dynamics are the best ways to do it. And of course, it's something that is a learning curve. As we play the games, we learn the games. Anything else that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think like the best way I sort of figured out to keep this working, even if it's not particularly smooth in your group, is when you start over again with a new campaign or something, try and just really hammer in a habit of the GM and all the other players asking other people in the group to flesh out details about things. So like if you establish very early on that one of your players should ask other players what details about something are, or the GM will be asking the players details about what something is, then you can get people sort of in that habit and it makes things a lot more smooth. If you try and shoehorn it in something existing, it doesn't really work as well. And if you just establish that habit early on enough, then it'll sort of continue on with all of your other games. It sort of just makes everyone inherently more comfortable with that, taking on that sort of role.
That's been the somewhat shortened but still very enlightened version of the Mathsquad podcast. I'd like to remind our listeners and viewers that the Mathsquad is a community around one very interesting person. That's tabletop game designer and one of the designers of Dungeon World, Adam Koebel. You can find him on Twitter under Skinny Ghost and on Twitch and YouTube under Adam Koebel. And you should always check out Dungeon World, which is powered by the Apocalypse World engine. Scaridium, can you tell the listeners where they can find you on the wide web?
Yeah, I'm pretty much everywhere at Scaridium, Scaridium. Mostly Twitter, where I talk most about RPGs somewhat, but mostly science, neurobiology, ethics, and cognition and learning topics. As that's basically what I do in my professional life.
And of course, you can find myself, Rafael Piñero, and this channel under the Lesson Learned banner on YouTube. Thank you for listening, and we'll hope to see you when we see you. Good night.